Yevamos Daf Pei takes us to the end of the 9th parak of the Masechta and begins the 10th. We start with the Mishnah at the bottom of Daf Pei Vav, which discusses the halachos and summarizes the halachos of a woman who's married to a Kohen, Levi, or Yisrael, whether she can eat Truma, Meiser, or neither of them, and as to how it affects her if she has a child from a number of them through different marriages. The Gemara will give the sources of these halachos. Then the Gemara will compare the halacha of eating Truma based on a child who's a Kohen to being Chayav Yibum based on a child who's alive from different marriages. Then we'll begin the next parak, which will discuss the halacha of a woman who does not know whether or not her husband is alive, and she remarries. What is her halacha there? So the Mishnah begins. It's a lengthy Mishnah which goes through a long list of what happens step after step if a woman is married to a Kohen, then a Levi, then a Yisrael, and she has a child from the Kohen, the Levi, and then the Yisrael, and then the child of the Levi, of the Yisrael, the Levi, and the Kohen dies, so she no longer has any of them. Now, the principle is generally going to be as follows. If she's married to a Kohen and nothing else, she can eat Truma. If she has a child from a Kohen and no one else, then she can also eat Truma. If she has a lower level marriage, that supersedes her higher level marriage. So if she's married to a Yisrael and she has a child from a Kohen, she'll have the halachas of Yisrael. If she's married to a Levi and if she has a child from a Levi and a child from a Kohen, she'll have just halachos of the child of the Levi. She'll be able to eat Meiser and not Truma. So these are the principles that go through the Mishnah as we proceed through it step by step. So let's go through it. So it starts off with a woman who's a Bas Yisrael. Obviously, she has no right to eat Truma or Meiser. Then she marries a Kohen. Now she's part of the Kohen's household. She has the right to eat Truma. If he dies, so if she has no children, she goes back to her father's house. She can't eat Truma. If she has a child with him, so then the fact that she's the mother of a Kohen gives her the right to eat Truma as well. If, however, then she goes and she marries a Levi, now she has a child of a Kohen and a husband who is a Levi, the lower level supersedes, and now she can eat Meiser and not Truma. If the Levi dies, so if she has a child from the Levi, and then again she has both a child from a Kohen and a child from a Levi, and again the Levi supersedes, she can eat Meiser and not Truma. Then she marries a Yisrael, that supersedes both the Levi child and the Kohen child, now she cannot eat anything. If he dies, the Yisrael dies, now she has no husbands. If she has a child who's Yisrael, now she has a Kohen, Levi, and a Yisrael for a child. Again, the lower level supersedes and she cannot eat anything. Then, however, if the child who's a Yisrael, if he dies, that leaves her with a Kohen and a Levi, so she can eat Meiser and not Truma. Then if the Levi dies, she has only a child who's a Kohen, she goes back to eating Truma because of the child that she has who is a Kohen. If he dies, she has no children, no husband, she goes back to her father's house, and she's a Bas Yisrael, so she can't eat anything. Now the same thing is true in the reverse case if she was a Bas Kohen who then married others. So if she's a Bas Kohen, so she's a right to eat Truma, she marries a Yisrael, she cannot eat Truma any longer. If her husband dies, she goes back to her father's house, but if he leaves her child, now she's the mother of a Yisrael, she cannot eat Truma. If she then goes and marries a Levi, then she can eat Meiser. If he dies and leaves her a child, she can eat Meiser because of the child. She's the mother of a Levi. She goes and marries a Kohen. Now she can eat Truma because of her husband who's the Kohen. If he dies and leaves her with a child, now she can eat Truma because of the son who's a Kohen. If the son who's a Kohen, if he dies, she can't eat Truma. She just has the son who's a Levi, so she can therefore eat Meiser. If the Levi dies, she's left with only a son who's a Yisrael. She cannot eat Truma at all. She cannot eat anything because she has a son who's a Yisrael and no Kohen and no Levi relationship. If the child who's a Yisrael dies, she goes back to her father's house, and her father was a Kohen, so now she can eat Truma. This is a fulfillment of the pasuk that said, "V'shav al beis avia kinura milecha mavia tochel." A Bas Kohen who loses the right to eat Truma, but then she is divorced, widowed, and does not have a child, she goes back to her father's house, and she can eat the Truma from her father's house again. Now the Gemara begins, and the Gemara wants to know the source of at least one particular halacha. That is the halacha that when she has a son who's a Kohen and a son who's a Levi, and she has no right to eat Truma at that point because she goes with the son who's a Levi, but when the Levi son dies, she goes back to eating Truma because of her Kohen son. The Gemara says, how do you know that halacha? We never saw that halacha. We saw, the Torah says that if she's a Bas Kohen, and she loses the right to eat Truma because she marries Yisrael, and then that Yisrael dies, then she goes back to her father's house, she could eat truma because of her father. You never saw that she could go back to eat truma because of her son. Where do you see that? So the Gemara says it's learned out of the pasuk which says she could eat truma because of her father. The extra vav there, it says ubas kohen. It didn't have to say ubas kohen. What's the extra vav? So the Gemara says that's to include that she can go back to truma because of her son, not because of her father. So the Gemara says it's only according to Rabbi Akiva, who makes drushes from a vav. The Gemara says no, even according to the Rabbanan, the whole phrase ubas kohen is extra. It didn't have to say that. Just before we had started the previous sentence with ubas kohen, and we could have here just said and she. And we didn't have to say ubas kohen again, therefore that entire phrase is extra to teach me this halacha. Alright, now the Gemara introduces another halacha, and the Gemara is going to try to find sources for it. The Gemara will go through 5 different sources for this halacha. The Gemara says when she goes back to eat truma from her father's house, she only gets to eat truma, not chaz v'shok. The halacha is that a kohen gets a number of gifts that he could eat. Truma is just one of them. Another is parts of a korban shlamim, the chaza, the chest, and the shok, the leg, that the kohen can eat and he can feed his family. But if he had a daughter who married Yisrael and then came back to eat truma, she does not go back to eating chaz v'shok. That's not included. So the Gemara says, what's the source of this halacha? The Gemara is going to try a number of sources and have a back and forth on one of them. So the Gemara's first source, the Gemara says, is because it says when it describes when she originally married Yisrael that she can't eat truma anymore. It says he b'trumas hakachim lo sochel. She cannot eat trumas hakachim. Trumas hakachim is a phrase that includes karbanos. It calls it trumas hakachim, that's which is taken off the karbanos. That's the chaz v'shok. And on that, it never says that she goes back to. It says in the next pasuk that she goes back to eating it if she gets divorced or widowed from her husband who's a Yisrael. She goes back to eating truma, but it doesn't say she goes back to eating this trumas hakadashim. Okay, that's the Gemara's first source. Gemara's second source is Rabbi Baravua. He says it says that she goes back to eating milechem aviyah. She goes back to eating from the bread of her father's house. Now you understand that lechem refers to all types of food, not just bread. So first the truma and karbanos, but milacha means some of the bread, some of the food of her father's house she can eat, not all of them. She can only eat the truma and not the karbanos. So the Gemara has a kasha on that. The Gemara says, how do you know that that's coming to say that she can't eat karbanos from her father's house? Maybe it's coming to say that her father does not have the right to be meifir her neder anymore. A girl's father can cancel her nedarim, so therefore she can eat his food that she made a neder against because he cancels it. Maybe it means to say that his food that she made a neder against, that he can no longer cancel once she has already been married to someone else. She doesn't come back to that halacha. So maybe that's what milechem is coming to exclude, that she can't eat when she goes back to her father's house. Mar says no, it can't be referring to that because we have a different pasuk that teaches me that. And the Gemara quotes Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel, learns that out of the pasuk as follows. It says v'neder almana grusha yakum aleha. A vow made by an almana or grusha who's married to someone else sticks to her. She cannot. It's not. There is no hafara. If she's a single girl who's never married her father, could be made for it, can cancel it. If she's married, her husband can. If she's divorced, so she's in neither her father's property, her father's rishus, nor her husband's rishus as far as canceling vows go. And therefore, we learn from there, the Torah says explicitly, Neder Amana Gusha Yakum Alah. So the Gemara says, what's that for? That entire phrase should be empty. Obviously, she doesn't have a husband, she doesn't have a father's rishus. So what's it for? So the pasuk is to tell me in a case where she was never married, but she is out of her father's rishus. That's if her father sent her to meet the messengers, the shluchim of her husband, or the father's shluchim sent her to meet the shluchim of her husband, and she never made it to her husband's house. He died on the way. So now she is left her father's house, but she never entered her husband's house. That's what this pasuk is coming to teach me. Either way, this is the pasuk that teaches me that she cannot have hafaras nedarim anymore. I don't need the pasuk of milechem aviyah. So that must be coming to teach me that she doesn't eat from all. She doesn't eat all of her father's food. She can eat truma, but not karbanos. Now the Gemara gives another source. Rav Safra says lechem refers only to bread and not to meat. So lechem aviyah she can eat, but the meat, the karbanos of her father's house, she cannot eat. Now Rav Papa goes back to the other understanding, lechem refers to all food, but it says that it's only lechem aviyah, only food which belongs to her father. Truma is considered to be the property of the Kohen. Chaz v'shok is not considered property of the Kohen, it's considered to be carbon meat, it belongs to Kadosh Baruch Hu, and he lets Kohanim eat from his table, but it's not the Kohen's property, and therefore she can't go and eat that, because it doesn't count as lechem aviyah. Rava says, last pshat, it says, V'eschazei atnufa v'eshrek truma toichlu ato uvonecha uvenosecha itcha. The chaz and shah can only be eaten by your daughters when they are itcha, when they are with you. Once they were married, they don't qualify as itcha anymore. All right, now the Gemara adds one more halacha on the subject here. The Gemara says that Rav Ada bar Ava taught a brisa that says when she goes back to Beis Avia, she eats only truma and not chaz v'shok. But if she goes back because of her son, she goes back to eat because she has a son who's a Kohen. She had another son who was a Levi or a Yisrael, but that son dies and she goes back to eat because of her son who's a Kohen. Then she does go back to chaz v'shok. So Gemara says, how could that be? It was learned out of ubas, the extra vav. So the extra vav just tagged it on to the halacha of going back to her father's house. It can't have more halachos. Gemara says no, because there's a special miyut in the case of the bas, but of the father's house there is no miyut of milechem. We don't have all those miyutim that we listed earlier. We don't have that on the rights that she gets from her son, who is a Kohen. Now the Gemara moves on to discuss more of the sources of the halacha about a Bas Kohen who goes back to her father's house when she loses her husband and her son. The Gemara is going to show the details of that halacha as well as compare it to Yibum, in which halachas apply. So first of all, the Gemara says, V'shaval Beis Avia, she has to go fully back to her father's house. That excludes a Shomeres Yavam. If she has a Zika connection to a Yavam, she's not considered going back to her father's house. She does not eat Truma from her father's house. When it says Kinurel, like in her youth, that's to exclude if she's pregnant. She's not fully the way she was in her youth. She's not empty like in her youth. Now the Gemara says later, it also says Zera Einla, to teach that she has no children. So why do you have to tell me both that she's not pregnant and she has no children? Wouldn't it be enough to say one of those? The Gemara says no. Each one needs to be said. If you just said she has no children, I may think when she's pregnant, that's not called having children because there's no separate body from her. There is no separate creature created. There's just her and whatever's within her. So maybe that does not allow her to go back to her. That does not passel her from returning to her father's house. If it would only say that she's pregnant, she can't go back to her father's house, that might be because she's full. Maybe as long as she's empty, she can go back to her father's house, even if she has children. That's why we have to say both pregnant and Zera Einla, both will prevent her, both a pregnancy and a child from Yisrael will prevent her from going back to her father's house. Now, the Gemara discusses why can't we make a kal v'chomer from the sugya of P'tur Yibum and the sugya of Truma. Now, the Gemara gives one kal v'chomer here at first, and then the Gemara is going to add a whole bunch of other kal v'chomers, different ways to structure it. You have three basic halachas we're going to compare in the sugya of P'tur Yibum and Psol Truma. So having a child paters a woman from Yibum. Having a child from Yisrael also passels a woman from going back to Truma from her father's house. Were three questions of quasi-children. One is a child from a previous marriage. If she has a child from a previous marriage, then she's married to somebody and he dies without children. Does that pater her from Yibum to that man's brother? No, it does not. Previous marriage child doesn't count there. However, previous mile does pass her from eating Truma. If she's married to Yisrael and he dies without children, but she has a child from a previous Yisrael, she still can't go back to her father's house to eat Truma. So there, a previous child from a previous marriage does create a psol. It does count as a child to create a psol. Now, what if she's pregnant? Does that take her out of Yibum? Yes, it does take her out of the mitzvah of Yibum. A pregnant woman does not have to do Yibum, but it does not take her out of Truma. It does not passel her. It counts as a psol from Truma, but it does not give her the right to eat Truma. Now, what about a child who died later? Does that not count as a child anymore? So as far as the sugya of P'tur Yibum, it does count as a child. If she had a child when her husband died and then the child died, she doesn't go back to getting a zikas Yibum. A child who dies, the expression the Gemara uses that he's still considered to be alive as far as P'tur Yibum is concerned. As far as eating Truma, though, is not considered to be alive as far as creating a psul for Truma. A child who died from Yisrael is no longer passels her from being able to eat Truma. Now, the Gemara makes a kal v'chomer here as far as the case of a pregnancy passeling her from eating Truma. And the Gemara says if you compare Yibum and passeling from truma, it should be obvious that passing from truma is easier to do, because a previous marriage doesn't pater yibum, but it does passel from truma. So if that's the case, then if a pregnancy passels yibum, it paters yibum, then a pregnancy should also passel truma. So if I have the kavachomer, then the Gemara's kashas, it should be obvious that a pregnancy should passel from eating truma. Why do I need the pasuk of kinu re'ah to tell me that she cannot eat truma if she is pregnant from Yisrael? So the reason is because there is a pirch on this, and that is the third halacha. That is the halacha of what happens to a child who died. So in that case, the p'tur yibum is easier than psol truma. P'tur yibum is created by a child who died, but psol truma is not, and therefore you cannot necessarily learn that p'tur yibum is harder than psol truma, because here you see a case in which it is easier. Now, the Gemara it brings a siman and goes on to a number of other ways to structure these three halachos and figure out kavachomers. The Gemara will show why the kavachomer is no good for each one and why you need a pasuk to counteract it. So we'll first discuss a kavachomer in the case of the child who died. Try to change the halacha in p'tur yibum to learn it out of psol truma. We'll give a source that we can't change that, and then we'll say, if so, let's use the kavachomer the other way. Then we'll talk about the case of a child from a previous marriage. We'll first try to discuss the case of p'tur yibum. Again, give a source that I can't move that halacha, and then try to use the kavachomer the other way to change the halacha in the case of psol truma. So let's go through it. So the Gemara first of all says, we know that the halacha is that a child who died does not pater a woman from, that a child who died does pater a woman from yibum. That is to say that if she was pater from yibum because she had a child and then he died after she already got her patur, that fact that he died no longer messes up her patur yibum. So the Gemara says you shouldn't say that. You should say that that's not true. You should say that if the child dies, she goes back to falling to yibum. And the reason is you should learn it from the fact that that's true in the case of psol truma. A child who dies does not passel truma, doesn't create a psol truma. Now, psol truma is a lot easier to do than p'tur yibum, because you see, as far as children from a previous marriage, a child from a previous marriage does passel a bas kohen from eating truma, but it does not pater a woman from falling to yibum. So psol truma is easier to do, and yet the child who dies no longer passels her from truma, so the child who dies should no longer pater her from yibum. Someone says that can't be, because the Torah says dercha darchei noam. You have a situation where a woman was mutter to marry the shuk because she had a child, and then the child dies. Now it becomes us of her to stay married to her husband. She has to get chalitza, creates a rift between them. That can't be. That's not the kind of thing that the Torah would ever say, and therefore that shows that a halacha can't be correct. Someone says, well, if you're so sure that the case that a child who dies doesn't create a chiyuv yibum, he still paters yibum, so then I should learn from there to the case of psol truma, that a child who dies does create a psol truma. Even after he dies, she's still puzzled to eat truma. And I should learn that from the fact that like we said, a psol truma is a lot easier to do than p'tur yibum, because you see that a child from a previous marriage doesn't pater yibum, but it does passel truma. So if that's true, so psol truma is easier to do. So then, if a child who dies still paters yibum, a child who dies should still passel truma. The Gemara says no, because the Torah says zera einla. It says that the way you define a woman who's passel to eat truma is if she has children. If she has zera einla, she goes back to eating truma from her father's house. Once he dies, zera einla, she has no children, so she qualifies. All right, now we go to the discussion reversed. We compare as far as whether a child from a previous marriage should make a psol or not. So we see from the fact that we've already established the halacha in the case of a child who died that psol truma is harder to do than p'tur yibum. P'tur yibum is caused by a child even after he dies, but psol truma is not caused by a child after he dies. So p'tur yibum is easier, psol truma is harder. So if so in the case of a child who is from a previous marriage, we know that if the halacha is that a child from a previous marriage does passel a woman from eating truma. If she has a Yisrael from a previous marriage, the fact that her husband who's a Yisrael in this marriage dies without children doesn't mean she can eat truma. She's still passeled from eating truma by a child from a previous marriage. Then the child she has from a previous husband should also pater her from yibum, even if her current husband died without children. So why don't we say that? Kavachomer. Somewhere says no, because the Torah says that a woman falls to yibum when her husband dies, and uben ein lo, and this husband did not have a son. She has a son, but he doesn't have a son, and therefore qualifies as bein ein lo, and therefore her son from her previous marriage does not pater her from falling to yibum. So says, well, once that halacha is established, you should make the kavachomer the other way. If a child from a previous marriage is not pater from falling to yibum, it should not passel her from eating truma either, because we know that it is harder to passel from eating truma, like we see in the case of the child who died. Versus no, because again the Torah says zera ein la. Anyone who is a zera ein la qualifies, and if a child died, she's again a zera ein la, and she goes back to eating truma from her father's house. We now begin the next parak Isha Shahalach Baila L'Medis Hayam. It's called Ha'isha Rabba. Discusses the halacha, what happens when a woman's husband goes away and he disappears, she doesn't come back for a while, and she gets a heter to remarry, and then her original husband returns. So there are two possible scenarios in which this could happen. Her heter to remarry, the permission to remarry, could have been with one witness who said that her husband had died. One witness al pidin is not reliable, but the Beis Din will give her a psak that she can remarry. That psak is based on the fact that the Beis Din assumes she's going to do as much research as she can to make sure that her husband really is dead, and therefore she's allowed to remarry. Therefore, this has the halacha of a hora'as Beis Din. It's a psak the Beis Din gave her. On the other hand, she's responsible for it. She's not considered to be an ones. She's not considered to be like there's nothing she could do about it. She is held responsible if she doesn't do the research and the first husband does come back. Therefore, she is given certain halachos midrabanan of being married to both the first husband and the second husband. She's considered to be that she was mezana with both husbands. Now, if she got two witnesses who said that she's allowed to remarry, then she's considered to be an onus. So the Gemara is first going to go through what happens when there was one witness and Beis Din gave her a psak. Gemara will go through the opinion of Tanna Kama and many halachos, and then bring in some other opinions that argue. Afterwards, we'll go to what happens if she was given a psak. Well, not she was given a psak, but she had two witnesses and she didn't even need a psak. Okay, so first of all, if the Beis Din says she can remarry, and then her husband returns, so she's considered to be that she was a mezana. She's not considered to be an onus. She's still married to the first one al pidin, because the marriage to the second one didn't count. She was an eshes ish. But midrabanan, she has some aspects in which she's married to the second one. So the halachos are as follows. First of all, she can't marry either of them. She's also a baal, also a boel. She has to be set free from both of them. She requires a get from both of them. From the first one, midaraisa, she's married to. The second one is a get midrabanan. She does not get any ksuba. She loses the rights to both ksubas. She doesn't get any parts of the ksuba, not the return of the profits from her nechse mulug and her nechse tzon of arzel, not support, financial support, not clothing, not any of these things. Now, not from either of them. Now, if she took her ksuba or anything already, she has to return it. Children from both are a mamzer. Children from the second are a mamzer because she was mezana with him. Children from the first, if she goes back to him, are a mamzer midrabanan because she's considered married to the second one as well, midrabanan. Neither husband has the right to be metama to her if he was a kohen when she dies, and neither of them get the right to things that she finds. That's a relationship. That's a right that's granted to the husband in exchange for mazonos. They also don't get work that she does. They're not considered to be her husband as far as that's concerned. Neither of them could be made for her neder, could cancel her vows. If she was a bas Yisrael, so she has no ability to truma under any circumstances, but the fact that she was given, she had a bias zanos, makes her pasul to kahuna. If she was a bas Levi, she's pasul from Meiser. If she was a bas Kohen, she's pasul from meeting truma. Neither husband's inheritors inherit her. Neither one has the right to inherit from her. The Mishnah says neither one inherit her ksuba. The Gemara will ask, there is no ksuba, so what are they inheriting? Now, if she falls to yibum from either of them, she has to get chalitza from both. She's not allowed to do yibum. According to the Tanna Kama, midrabanan, they asked her to do yibum. Now, the Gemara brings a number of opinions that argue on some of these halachos, each one on one of them. So Rabbi Yosi says she does have a ksuba. It's from her first husband. Rabbi Elazar says the first husband does have the right to the things she finds and her work, and to be meifir neder. Rav Shimon says she does have the obligation to do Yibum, and she can do Yibum. There is no Isser Yibum from the first husband. If she had a tzara, if she was an erva, she patters the tzara, she's considered to be regular Yibum, and the child from the first husband is not a mamzer because she's not married to the second one. Now, if she got married with two witnesses, Beis Din was not involved in that, so there the halacha she's considered to be really an ones. It's really not her fault. Two witnesses are believable in all halachos. She's allowed to go back to her first husband. Everything else is considered to be an ones. There's nothing she can do about it. Now, is she chayav a carbon or not? Is she chayav a carbon for her bias znus? So there the halacha is that if she got a haras Beis Din because there was only one aid, and the Beis Din paskin, she's allowed to yachid, an individual who does something wrong, api haras Beis Din, the halacha is that she doesn't have to bring a carbon. If, however, she had two witnesses, then she's considered to be like she did in Isser Kares B'Shogeg, and therefore she does have to bring a carbon. Now, Rashi explains that it was a Shogeg. Everybody asks, Rashi said up to now if there's two witnesses, she's an onus, not a Shogeg. So we have to see what the explanation to that is. Now, the Mishnah ends off by saying, in a case where they gave her a heter to remarry, they only gave her a heter to remarry. They didn't give her a heter to go do bias znus with other people without nesuin. So if she does go and she is engaged in immoral behavior without getting married, there she doesn't have any heter. She cannot hide behind the Beis Din that gave her a heter. Now the Gemara begins, and the Gemara wants to get into the sugya of Eid Echad. We have only one witness. So the Gemara says the fact that the second case is talking about where she got married by two witnesses, and we said she's allowed to go back. The first case where it was stricter halachos, obviously she was married only by listening to one aid, and the Beis Din paskin that one aid is believable. We also have a brisa that says that. The brisa says that in the case of a woman who's trying to figure out if her husband is alive or not, she can trust one aid. We will trust one aid. We'll even trust a woman. We'll even trust a woman saying over in the name of another woman, from an eved, from a shivcha. You see there, one aid is believed as well. We have another case where one aid is believed. If one witness says to somebody, you ate chaylev, and he says, I didn't eat chaylev, so it's an argument between him and the witness. So there, you don't trust the witness, and he doesn't have to bring a carbon. If, however, he says, I don't know, you would trust the witness. The implication is, if he says, I don't know, you would trust the witness, even though it's possible that the witness is wrong, and if the witness is wrong, you're bringing a carbon to the Beis HaMikdash, you're not chayiv, that's an Isser. But no, we're going to trust one witness if you're not contradicting him. So where do you get this halacha from, that one witness is trusted? Says the Gemara, the source is as follows. We have a pasuk describing when someone finds out that he did an Isser Kares B'Shogeg, so now he has to bring a Karban Chatas. It says, Ahoda ilav Chataso. If he finds out that he's Chayav Chatas, that means that he only has to bring the Chatas if he finds out on his own. Somebody else tells him, you don't believe the guy who tells him, and he doesn't have to bring the Chatas. But that's only talking about where he doesn't contradict the guy. How do you know that? Because it says, Oh hoda ilav, that's mikol malkum, that's in all circumstances. So you only don't trust the aid if he's being contradicted by what you yourself say. However, if you yourself know otherwise, you don't trust the aid. That's the drasha, that's what the Torah is teaching me there. That shows me that if I'm not contradicting the aid is believed. Now, how do I know this is talking about one aid? It just says, Oh shahodiu. Maybe it's talking about there are two aidim. Where it says if there are two aidim, I wouldn't need a pasuk to say that he's believed. So it's got to be that it's talking about with this one aid. And here you see clearly, it's only when you contradict him that you win over the aid. If the aid says and you don't contradict him, so then you are chayiv and the aid is believed. So the Gemara's kasha is, how do you know that it's because of the aid's testimony? Maybe we're talking about a case where you were quiet and you yourself admitting that's what makes you chayiv. That's what makes you need to bring it. It's not the aid's testimony. It's your silence, which is a tacit agreement. And I'll show you the concept of shtika kaidah exists. If you're quiet, it counts as if you're admitting. Where do you see that? So the next case in the Brisa brings Machlokas between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. What happens if two Eidim say he ate, and he says he did not eat? According to the Chachamim, you trust him. You don't go with the two Eidim. He says he didn't eat chaylev. He doesn't bring a carbon. Rabbi Meir says, of course he brings a carbon, two Eidim. So what's this machlokes about? So Gemara says the Chachamim say he could get out of it by saying I ate and was bemazed. Since he has a way to get out of it by saying I ate and was bemazed, and a mazed doesn't bring a carbon, only a shagig brings a carbon. Therefore, he has a way to get out of it. He's believed when he says, I didn't eat it all. Now, Rabbi Meir says, no, if two witnesses, they're believed. It doesn't matter what. If you have a migu, you have a reason, a proof, you had another way out of it, it doesn't matter. You're always chayiv. Two eidim are believed all the time. Now, what were the Rabbanon, what were they referring to here when it was two eidim? So if there's two eidim, the guys believed. So what's the reason before when there's one aid, the aid is trusted and the aid is mechayiv from the carbon? How does that make sense? Two aidim are not mechayiv from the carbon and one aid is? Obviously the reason is because in the case of the one aid, he's quiet. And it's his quietness that's mechayiv the carbon. It's his agreement that's mechayiv the carbon. So you don't have a proof here to aid echad.